And this question comes from B, and she asks, why are there so many differences basically in the resurrection story when you're going through the Gospels? And let me pull it up. She does do, I'm assuming she. They reference Matthew relates to the earthquake and a single angel upon the stone that he had removed from the entrance. In John, there were two angels specifically inside the tomb, one where Jesus had been lain and one at the foot. In Mark, there's only one angel, but he was inside the tomb. In John, there's no mention of angelic encounter. So
Right.
what would you say? How do you relate that, Pastor Steve?
Well, basically, what you do when you go through the Gospels is you need to understand that what's being given there is the perspective from different viewpoints. And one of the things that you don't want when you have eyewitness testimony is exactly the same story. What you want to have is different viewpoints on the same events so that you can piece those things together. Guys in law enforcement know this.
I didn't know that until I started working there. And then you started writing reports,
Yeah.
and you realize how written eyewitness testimony works out.
Right, yeah. And so when you come up and two or three people are viewing an accident, they're always going to have different emphases, and they're going to be seeing things from a different viewpoint. Doesn't mean that the testimony is wrong. Sometimes it can be, but it doesn't mean that the testimony is wrong. It just means that they're different people. And so that's what you have in the Gospels. There are a number of really good books that will go through and reconcile all the resurrection appearances of Jesus. But I'll just give you a real quick overview of this stuff because I use this with people all the time. This is actually it's a good question, but it's a pretty common one. And so when you're looking at Matthew chapter 28, it lets you know. When it's talking about the angel, it lets you know how the stone got rolled away. It's one of the things that the women were worried about when they came. It says, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb, and behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it. His countenance was like lightning, his clothing as white as snow, and the guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men. But the angel answered and said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. And so it's this angel that's talking to them. But obviously, when the women got there, they're asking the question in the other Gospels, how are they going to roll away the stone? And there is no mention of the guards being there. The guards are the ones who saw the angel on the stone. And so the angel comes, there's an earthquake, the angel rolls away the stone, he sits on it, all the guards see him, they fall over like they're dead, and when they wake up, they split and take off. And after they're gone, then the women come, and that's when they have the conversation with the angel, okay? And so we know that from comparing it to other passages. Over in Mark's gospel, and by the way, you have different lists of the women who came to the tomb too. And one of the things again that you need to remember about that is the fact that if somebody's put in one list and they're not put in another, doesn't mean that they weren't there. It just means that the writer is not mentioning the people that were there. And so I went to lunch yesterday with Zach and Matt, two of my guys on staff. And I might mention that to you, but I might be talking to somebody else and say, I went to lunch with Christy and Lindsay. They're my secretaries. And then the two people that I talk to get together. For some reason, they're talking about my day. And one says, well, Steve's told me he went out to lunch with Christy and Lindsay. And the other person goes, well, no, he told me he went out to lunch with Matt and Zach. And the fact is I went to lunch with all four of them. And so I might be mentioning a person's name just because I'm dealing with people who know that person. I'm not necessarily saying, giving a whole list of the people I went out with, because I went out with 12 people for lunch yesterday. And so it's the same thing in the Gospels. When you get to the Mark 16 passage, it says, but when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. And this is the passage where they're worrying about how they're going to roll away the stone. And in verse 5 it says, and entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. And the question there is, the right side of what? What's he sitting on the right side of? And when you get to Luke's gospel, over in Luke chapter 24, it talks about the women coming, and it says, and it happened as they were greatly perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in shining garments, there in the tomb. And as they were afraid and bowed their faces down to the earth, they said to them, why do you seek the living among the dead? He's not here, but is risen. Remember how he spoke to you when he was still in Galilee. And, the passage goes on with that whole thing. And so it's Luke's gospel that identifies that there were actually two angels. The other gospels talk about one angel that talked to the women. And so when I'm looking at that, what I'm getting is I'm getting more information, because obviously the angels weren't both sitting there speaking in stereo. They weren't both saying exactly the same things at the same time. You're going to have an angel there that's a spokesman, and the other angel is going to be the guy nodding his head. Yes, that's the absolute truth, if he says anything at all. And so two of the Gospels are mentioning one angel. Matthew's Gospel is mentioning the one angel who rolled away the stone and was apparently the spokesman. Mark's Gospel is mentioning one angel, but it says he stood to the right. And the right of what? And it's probably the right of the other angel, is that we're talking about. Luke's Gospel tells you that they're two angels and they had the same message, but we know that they weren't saying the same thing at the same time. And John's Gospel is different from both of them, because what happened with John's Gospel, you get a little bit more information when you get there. And what happens in that instance is when Mary comes to the tomb, it says, first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early, obviously with the other women, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter. So Mary never went into the tomb. So as soon as she saw the stone rolled away, she took off from the other women. The other women go in and have the conversation with the angel, and she goes to get Simon Peter and John. And they run up, and by the time that they get to the tomb, because Mary's had to run all the way back to wherever John and Peter are staying, tell them the story, get them to come. They all come back, and by the time that they get back to the tomb, which is outside of town, the other women are gone. And so they get back to the tomb, and Peter and John go inside and examine everything. And it's after that Peter and John leave, and Mary stays there, and that's when she has the appearance of Christ. And so what you have is a number of different stories that took place on the same day, right around at the same time at the tomb, and they're easily reconcilable. And that's just a real simple way of reconciliation. But again, you have to come at it from the point of view of you've got different people in different places doing different things and seeing the events, and you need to be able to put them together. Now, the Bible said that Mary or Salome in one gospel went to the tomb, and in another gospel it says Salome did not go to the tomb. That's when you have a contradiction.
Right.
Or if they said Peter and John never went to the tomb, and then you have in John's gospel it says that yes, they did go to the tomb. That's a contradiction. But in all the other instances, what you have is more information, and what you do is you piece it together and you find out what the story is.
Yeah, and all those different details authenticate a flow or a story, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have when you have an event like that, like usually when I was in corrections, if you had an event, you're talking about something that could last from a minute to, a really big event was probably half an hour. Mm-hmm. Okay, and if something major happened, like let's say there was a in custody death or something, detectives come over and they piece together that whole thing. So they're grabbing everyone's involved reports. And sometimes it's really hard reading those reports, depending on how they were written, to actually get the flow when you weren't there. And you got to piece all those things together.
Yeah.
But one thing we know is if they were all the same,
yep,
we know that there was either collusion or that one person wrote it and everyone else copied the same report.
Right.
Because if you didn't have all the stuff that the Gospels has, it's not enough. It de-authenticates it, if that's a word.
Right. It's not an eyewitness. It's obviously not an eyewitness account, or
Right.
it's collusion.
Yeah.
And so you don't want either of those. So
Okay.
yeah. So that's the best kind of evidence you can have for the resurrection stories.